Welcome back to You're All Doomed, the podcast that used to go through the Friday the 13th movies 13 minutes at a time, and now we're going through the fan films just kind of however we want to do it. I'm Brian.
I'm Robe Ranger Greg.
In this episode, we are discussing Here Comes the Night, the Part 3 movie, a Friday the 13th fan film. This is the third and apparently final installment in the Here Comes the Night franchise. And we also are going a little bit out of release order. If you had been listening to the earlier episodes, we had talked about how we just kind of wanted to get to the conclusion of this to kind of figure out what was going on rather than wait another 4 or 5 movies. So we're jumping ahead just temporarily so we can close this one out. But we finally got to the exciting conclusion of the Here Comes the Night trilogy. So we might as well do a recap of the first two from what we remember. So the first one, I'm not going to remember any of the character names, but the first one, there's 3 people that showed up and in the woods, and they're going to go camping. And then they started getting like picked off by someone in a hockey mask. And then at the very end, a girl shows up dressed as Jason, along with 2 other people that were just dressed like Jason. And there was some weird interaction there, and Jason killed all of them, I think.
All of them.
And so that one, that first movie kind of ended on a pretty cool cliffhanger and we certainly had tons of questions about what the relationship was with all these people that were showing up and why were they dressed like Jason and things like that. So we were hoping that with part 2, we would start to get some answers, and we didn't really get any answers. It just kind of was more of the same, and it kind of made
added
things a little bit more
some more questions, really.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was just a different group of people that showed up, and we got a little bit more kind of like context into what was going on, but certainly no explanation as to why these things were happening. And then part 2 ended with the 3 survivors who were Billy, Susie, and Allison, and they were kind of floating away on the lake in their boat. And Allison, who was the blonde girl, had like a stack of Polaroids that was what we learned kind of the list of victims and how they were supposed to be disposed of. And I think like the final shot was Allison kind of giving some kind of glance to the camera that kind of implied that she was like flipping a switch and she was suddenly going to be one of the killers from, in the next one or something like that. So it just
we got the sense that she at least knew what was going on amongst this large group of friends and acquaintances, but it was no more clear to us, the viewers.
So that brings us up to part 3,
which jumps right in with the title card. They have like one little kind of moment of spooky music and maybe even like a scene of the dark lake, but then it's like bam, title card, you're in, moving.
And there's a little bit of like voiceover in the background from the first 2 movies. Nothing that's really going to inform too much. It's just kind of reminding you of like some key moments from the first 2 movies.
Almost more like mood setting, really.
Yeah. And then the first shot we see is a cop car pulling up, and this is Sheriff Chip, and he's radioing somewhere, which we'll talk to him about that in a minute. But he's radioing somewhere, and he's just basically letting the person on the other end of the radio know that he's arrived at this abandoned car that they were looking for. And at first, there's no response on the other end. Then someone does pick up, and it's Ranger Dale, who is wearing the aforementioned bathrobe and drinking, I think, some kind of margarita.
That's what I thought too, but then they talk about rum later, so maybe it's just some sort of rum punch concoction.
Yeah, I couldn't tell because, we can talk about that because there's lots of confusing things going on with these drinks. But I'm not exactly sure what's going on with Ranger Dale here or what his role is, because like he's in a bathrobe. We've mentioned that he's drinking, and I guess it's like, I don't know if it's the end of his shift or if he just works in such a boring town, which he mentions was Forest Green. if it's just so boring that he's just not expecting any kind of action, like why else would he be drinking on
Right.
the job like
Is he
this?
on duty, or is he just like helping out because he knows that the officer Chip is making a run, and so he's just kind of being the guy in the seat?
I don't know, and I don't want to give away anything just yet about his location because we learn a little bit more about it later. But it's like he's not in an office, and so it's almost like he's a volunteer police officer or something who
Like a
just
ham radio enthusiast or something.
yeah, and he just because it's a small town police force, maybe it's just his shift for that particular week or whatever, and it's wrapping up, and he wasn't expecting anything to be going on, so he's drinking this drink and just having a good old time. But he's
Before we move on, I want to just, I like this opening a little bit because it kind of expands the scope of the Here Comes the Night series. So far, the previous two movies have been about a very closed group of people who all know each other, and there weren't really any outsiders shown. And it was like this, this opens with a police car, and then there's these new kind of uninvolved characters, and so it just feels like it's widening the sphere a little bit, and I'm glad to see that progression throughout this little mini series.
yeah, and it also was not at all what I was expecting, like what I was expecting for the third movie to kick off with, considering how the second one ended. The 2nd one, there was a lot of like panic and chaos and these, kind of suggestions that maybe Allison was going to be a killer. And then all of a sudden it's just like, nope, we're not even going to be in the boat. We're not going to be with those characters that you're familiar with. You're just with Ranger Dale.
And there's not a lot of continuity with the panic, as we'll get to momentarily.
Not at all. But Dale, like, I can't decide if I like Dale or not. He is a lot to handle. He is just constantly joking around, and he's drunk, so he's like, he's playing a part. But
Drunk Dale is probably more obnoxious than regular Dale.
I would agree, yeah. And so, like, there's something. He's not obnoxious, he's not like the rednecks from A New Beginning or anything like that. He's just this goofball, but we just get a lot of Ranger Dale in the first like 5-10 minutes of this movie, and it's like, okay, dial it back just a little bit.
Yeah.
Ranger Dale.
Yeah, he asks a lot of questions about this abandoned car, and yeah, he's going a little too hard in, and Officer Chip is getting audibly annoyed with him as well.
We go back to the cop, and this car that he has found is an early 70s Datsun 240Z. And I don't know if you picked up on this, Greg, but the license plate was Meg 4N1. And if you look at it kind of like through squinted eyes, it says Megan 1.
Right.
So I'm just presuming that this is Megan's car. And there's a couple of things in there that kind of support that as well, which is in the trunk, there was a Polaroid camera, and Polaroids obviously played a pretty big part in the first two movies. You had, I forget the girl from the first movie, Sarah or whatever. She had like a Polaroid of Megan actually taped to her dashboard or something. And then obviously the Polaroids that we saw in the second one that showed all the, future victims. So starting to tie things together. But what I didn't understand is why it was just Megan's car, because there was quite a few people that were there, but it was, this is what this cop has found is Megan's car abandoned in the woods.
Right. And then I think he hears like a snapping twig or something, but randomly just goes off into the woods in the dark. I mean, there's no indication that he's like following a trail or anything. He just kind of wanders into the woods, which I found strange.
Mm-hmm. We end up going back to, and we can, as we go through this, we can decide what this place really is. I think it's Ranger Dale's house that he's stationed at with this CB radio, because he has a lot of like personal belongings there. He's even signing divorce papers. So yeah, again, I mean, I think that lines up with kind of the small town police force where they wouldn't necessarily have like a full functioning police station. Maybe there's just this, guy who volunteers his time to pick up the radio.
Well, or if he's like the park ranger for this area, where like he's separate from the police force but works in tandem with. So I mean, he probably lives in this section of wilderness that he oversees, and so he's got his kind of homestead and then his semi-attached workspace for ranger business.
That's true, because I think at one point he does say Forest Green Park, which makes, explains why he's a ranger. But yeah, I guess that probably makes more sense. Yeah, and the sheriff found the car within the park, so he has to radio to the ranger to let him know. So, okay. So yeah, that's starting to make a little bit more sense.
Along with the divorce papers on the table, he's got a copy of an issue of Mad Magazine and then a porno mag, which I'm only assuming is Drip Dry again, but I didn't pause it to look.
Yeah, it is. It's the same issue as Drip Dry, or same issue of Drip Dry that we saw in the first two.
Do you have a copy there with you?
I do. Yes, it's drying out. The Mad Magazine was from the summer of '89, and on the front it says 96 pages of hot collector's items, featuring 35 pages on school and perfect reading during boring classes. And you can buy a new copy of this Mad Magazine on eBay for $10.
Was it like a super special?
It was, yeah. Summer 1989 super special.
Gotcha.
I loved Mad Magazine. I had a subscription for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did too. My sisters had, several issues for car trips growing up. So, I mean, even though I was too little to get most of the jokes, I always liked it. And then, yeah, like in the mid 80s, I was definitely a reader. I don't know that it holds up.
Probably not.
I've found some of my old issues, purging my basement and stuff. And, there's some, stuff that I look on fondly, but most of it's kind of geared at a younger audience for sure.
I like the movie spoofs that they did. And then that little fold out thing in the back where you could it would create two different pictures depending on how you folded the back cover or something like that.
Yeah. Al Jaffe, he just died like a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. So Ranger Dale is listening to a song that sounds an awful lot like Holiday by Madonna, but it's not. It's like, instead of like Holiday, it's some guy going, celebrate.
Right. I was almost picturing Alexis Arquette singing it from The Wedding Singer.
Right. But there's suddenly a knock at Ranger Dale's door, and it's Billy, Susie, and Allison from the boat at the end of part 2. Billy is covered in Ted's blood, because remember, Ted was murdered by Jason, and says he needs to use Ranger Dale's phone. And then Allison just goes straight to the fireplace and sits down. And then Susie just switches straight into obnoxious mode.
But here's what I was referring to earlier. Like, they seem remarkably calm and unconcerned, even when they discuss the fact that Ranger Dale's phone isn't working. They should be freaking the fuck out. Or at least like, oh my God, we're so happy you're here. Help us. We need help. Like they're just kind of stride on in like they were expected for a weekend visit or something.
They're definitely very kind of calm, and there's no sense of urgency. And despite the fact that like Billy's completely covered in blood, he's not really in a hurry to get it off his face.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if I had blood all over my face, I think I would try to wipe it off almost immediately. I wouldn't wait until the end of my boat ride to do it. But yeah, there's a lot of like mixed signals, considering that just minutes earlier, they were watching people getting brutally murdered, people that they know and were friends with. And they just show up and they're like, hey man, I got to use your phone. And there is something that comes up a little bit later that I think somewhat justifies their behavior. And we'll get to that. But I agree. My first reaction was like, why are they not more concerned? Like Susie in particular. Susie's just like, oh, hi, what's going on? Oh, nice place. Ooh, what you drinking? Can I have some? She's just like, she does not strike me as someone who just saw people brutally murdered minutes earlier.
Right. And I mean, then they split up into these two pairs. Billy and Allie hang back at Ranger Dale's house while Dale and Susie go out to the bunkhouse where he has his official radio, and they continue their little repartee. And so it's like this movie's tone is definitely leaning more comedically than the previous two. Not, notice I don't say funny, I say comedic. Yeah, she's laying it on even thicker than she was in the previous installment.
Yeah. There's one point where, because Ranger Dale's still carrying around his drink, whatever it is, and Susie's like kind of playing around with him, and she's like, "Oh, let me take a sip," and she takes a sip, and like before she's even done swallowing it, she goes, "Oh, brain freeze." And like, there's a couple of things, like, I think we discussed this in the second one, where it just seemed like a lot of the dialogue was improvised, and that's totally fine. Like, but it just didn't make sense because, one, this drink that Dale was drinking wasn't frozen. It was just like poured from this giant like pitcher, and it didn't have any ice in it. So like, it couldn't possibly be cold enough to give her like instantaneous brain freeze. But it was just one of those examples of like throwing lines in that just didn't really seem to make sense at the time. And
I mean, I sort of think that it was supposed to be like it was in the blender, so maybe he was trying to make like frozen margarita slushy kind of thing. But they specifically mentioned rum too. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. It was, it definitely felt very improv. And I mean, I'm sure that the actress is perfectly lovely, but the way the way they've made her up and they're shooting her in this, she looks a lot like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
She reminded me of the I can't remember the name, Chandler's girlfriend from
Janice.
Yeah, Janice.
Oh my God!
Just kind of like the same like attitude, and I don't know, but yeah, it was just, you had mentioned how it was interesting seeing this like wider universe, and like I agree, but it's just setting a really weird tone to the beginning of this, where it's like we're at the conclusion of this trilogy and it's just very kind of like jokey, and it's not really setting things up to be suspenseful at all, because it's just everyone's kind of like running around and everyone's kind of got their own little, spiel going on. Billy
is now in the bathroom at the main house, and he's very concerned with the cleanliness of his glasses while he's covered, head to toe in blood elsewhere. But he's also weeping over a wristwatch, and I believe that that's like the guy that looked like Stephen Colbert and got his arm hacked off in the previous installment. That was the watch that was like laying in the field beeping, I'm guessing.
Yes, and I had to go back and look at that too. His character's name was Davis, and we get a little bit of an explanation about that relationship later, so we'll just go into it then. But yeah, that was kind of a surprise, where I was like, oh, because I think we even commented in the second one, like, why is he picking up the watch? Like, who cares?
Right.
And then we learned that there is a connection with the watch. So that was kind of a nice touch. I thought it was, they're starting to connect the worlds, because one of our kind of, I don't know if you call them problems, but questions that we had about the first two is like, how are these people connected, and like, why are they together? And now we're starting to hear, and even a little bit later on, we learned a little bit more about why they're so connected. But yeah, I thought that was a kind of a nice touch.
Agreed. We do a quick check-in with Officer Chip. He's found a couple of tents, a little campsite that are empty. And he also finds one of those Polaroids that was laying on the ground, left behind. So he picks that up and he heads back to his squad car.
I think the Polaroid was, I think it said Jack, and Jack was the stoner, I think, from the first one, who was like blowing smoke through the hockey mask.
The first owner of the Drip Dry magazine?
Yes.
Got it. Allie is gazing into the fire in the fireplace, and Billy has emerged from the bathroom and found a small bottle of vodka and uses it to clean a pretty big gash that she's got on her arm. She swigs some of the vodka from the bottle and also makes a joke about him being a great nurse someday, and it's a reminder that he's actually in his residency to become a doctor.
I mean, it's funny that you thought that it was a pretty gaping wound on her arm because I thought it was pretty weak, and the fact that it
funny.
needed any medical attention was kind of surprising because, like, it just looked like a scratch to me. It didn't, like, it certainly wasn't like pouring blood. But one thing we should point out is while she's sitting there, getting tended to by Billy, she's playing with a Zippo lighter, like she's trying to recreate the opening theme from Lethal Weapon 3. So, we'll see if that's something that'll come back later.
She's muttering about how Megan was wrong. And Billy asks her, wrong about what? And she kind of dismisses the question. So we're getting some seeds here of her knowledge of what has been going on here.
This is when we go back to Sheriff Chip, who's done kind of patrolling the woods, and he's heading back to his cop car. And Jason shows up, and we know this because we can hear him stomping from 200 miles away. And we also know that Jason was able to hear Sheriff because this particular Jason has gigantic ears.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does.
His profile looks like Charlie Brown. He's got this, like, the round, perfectly round head for the mask, and these ears that are just like sticking out way too far from the mask.
So when we hear his mother, like, in giving him instructions in his own head, it's wah, 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 wah. Yeah, so he gets macheted a couple times, and so he's dead. So now we've lost the wider scope that we were so excited to have when this movie started. And we flash back to the bunkhouse where Dale and Susie are hitting on each other and bantering. And there's some games on a shelf clearly visible behind Dale. So I'm curious, of these three, Brian, which one do you prefer? Yahtzee, Sequence, or Pictionary?
Which one is Sequence? Is that kind of like a version of dominoes where you have to like connect numbers or something?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with it, but it is kind of a math-based number game.
It's been so long since I've played Yahtzee. I don't even remember if I liked it. I don't know. I guess I'd say Pictionary. The only problem with that is you end up getting stuck with people who don't know how to draw, and I find that more frustrating than fun. Like if they can't draw what they're trying to communicate. But yeah, I'd say probably Pictionary.
We play a lot of Yahtzee at our house, and I like Pictionary, but my wife and I were forbidden from teaming up because we seem to know each other's like mental shortcuts so well that we were, even with like two lines that represent nothing, we were guessing each other's answers, and so we've now been split apart when it comes to playing Pictionary.
That's awesome. We're back in the bathroom at Ranger Dale's fuck shack or whatever it is, and Allison's just kind of like staring into the mirror, and Billy shows up and sees Allison also holding the watch, and this is where he tells her that he got it for Davis, who he called Slugger, which I thought was interesting. Have you ever called anyone Slugger in your life or known someone named Slugger?
Just you when I'm thinking about you in the shower.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's some kind of like inscription on the watch that says something like, swing for the fences, Slugger, or something like that. And so we're led to believe that Billy and Davis were in a relationship, but then we also learn, and correct me if you picked up on this or if you picked on something different, but Billy and Allison are brother and sister.
Oh, I did not get that. Interesting.
Yeah, because Allison says that when we, and I took that to mean Billy and Allison were younger, they went to camp at Camp Crystal Lake with Megan and Sarah from the first movie, and they went there as kids, and all the counselors thought that Allison, Megan, and Sarah were sisters. And I feel like there was something else in there that led me to believe that, like the way she phrased it, like she never specifically said like, "Oh, Billy, you're my brother," but it was like,
like you do.
Right. It was just something that said, "Oh, like I think It's possible that they are just longtime friends, but the way I picked up on it was that they were brother and sister.
That would be an interesting facet. A couple of things here. One is, I I have absolutely no problem with Billy and Davis apparently having been romantically involved. I don't find Slugger to be their most romantic nickname in the world, but fine. And I just feel like Billy would be even more distraught if his romantic partner has been found brutally murdered. I mean, I guess you could argue that like he's more in survival mode right now and the grief will come later. But like just given how nonchalantly they strolled in the door, I feel like once they reached safety that Billy would have broken down a lot more visibly. Whatever. That's neither here nor there. As far as the sibling relationship between Billy and Allison, interesting. I feel like she would know whether her brother was in training to be a nurse or a doctor.
That's true.
But it would be an interesting facet to their relationship, especially given what we learn about what is going on here.
Right. Yeah, and it doesn't really impact the story. That's what I picked up on, was that they were related, and then it just started to kind of like tie these groups together a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
But another thing that Allison says is that Megan, who was the girl who was dressed up as Jason at the end of the first one, her parents were apparently killed, and
Right.
that obviously things changed for her after that, and she was really different. And I'm wondering, and there's really nothing else that points to this, but like, I'm wondering, is this supposed to be Megan Garris from Jason Lives? Because like the fact that you've got a character named Megan and her parents were killed. Now, we never saw Megan's mom.
Right. I think she died like when Megan was young.
That's right. You're right.
I don't think that we're supposed to think it's Megan Garris. I do think that we're supposed to think maybe that her parents were killed by Jason, and that sparked her fascination with Jason.
Definitely.
But I don't think it's Megan Garris.
Okay, that's fine. And I think you're right, because I think Megan's mom died of cancer or something, because there may have even been some in Jason Lives, because I feel like there was a line in there about like
Jason lives, but Megan's mom does not.
Right. There was something about how, Megan had been giving her dad a bad time or a hard time since her mother died or something. So, okay, you're right. I was just wondering, and again, this doesn't really impact the story. I'm just wondering if this was kind of like a subtle reference to a character that we already knew, but it doesn't sound like it is. It's just Megan, and I agree, it's definitely implied that her parents were killed by Jason, and that's what sort of starts this obsession that Megan has with Jason.
Yeah, and apparently Megan and Ted, who was the crazy guy from part 2, were in like this subgroup of this larger friend group. They were sort of the get drunk crew, and that small group was somehow obsessed with Jason, probably led by Megan's fascination. So some people are aware of the Jason Voorhees history, and some people think it's just legend. I mean, I think that Susie even refers to him as like scary butcher hockey dude. Mm-hmm. So it's not like he's a household name. People are just kind of associating him with like the hook hand myth or something like that. But then there are some people who are devotees, and apparently Megan and Ted were the leader of this little subgroup. Allie, as she's telling this to Billy, says, "None of this makes sense." And my response was, "Not the way you're telling it, it doesn't."
Right. Yeah, like we can wait until we get to the end to kind of see if all of our questions have been answered. But I don't know if, like, currently, I still have some questions.
Susie has returned to the main house to get a refill on their drinks, and she sees on the kitchen table the divorce papers and learns that Deputy Dale, or Ranger Dale's ex-wife, was named Deborah. And I mean, I was a little bit surprised to learn that it was a woman. I thought Dale might have been, much like Billy and Davis, a gay man. But okay, he was married to a woman, and now he and Susie are hitting it off.
Back in the bunkhouse, Susie arrives with the drinks, and this is where something is revealed that kind of sort of justifies their kind of like lackadaisical approach to everything that's going on. And that's when Susie says to Ranger Dale, it must be lonely living on this island all by yourself. And Dale's just like, island? Who said anything about an island? And I really liked this because one, there was no, like, they didn't hint at this at any other time, as far as I can tell. This just kind of came up. And I'm like, well, that kind of makes sense then. I mean, like, not that they would completely be able to wipe their memories of everything that had happened half an hour earlier, but like there would be this like false sense of security if they thought that they were on an island. And they're kind of like, okay, we got away. What do we need to do? All right, we got to call the authorities. We got to figure out how we're going to get out of here. Like they've been able to kind of like calm themselves down. It's still not realistic the way they're behaving, but it did kind of offer a little bit of a justification for me that they're letting their guard down because they truly feel like they're safe now.
You're absolutely right. And that makes a lot of sense. I don't like it. I think that it almost feels like something they had to throw in to explain why the acting was so subpar. I don't know. Like, that seems like a weird... It seems an unnecessary plot point if you just have the actors behave differently when they arrive. But it also makes them seem like fucking idiots.
Yeah, that's true.
Especially if they've been here before.
Well, I mean... I guess they have, and also we didn't really see their journey from the dock to wherever they are now. And again, I don't remember if anyone said anything in the previous movie about their, head to the island for safety or anything like that. So I don't know why any of them would presume that it is an island, or maybe it's just Susie that thinks that, and she's the one that's the most calm about everything. So, she's already established herself as not the brightest bulb in the batch. So maybe she just told herself that or convinced herself that it's an island. But I didn't really have a problem with it. And like, they didn't make a big deal out of it. It kind of like came up and Dale said it's not an island and that's it. So like, I would have probably had a bigger problem with it if they had spent a lot of focus on the fact, like the first 15 minutes of this movie, they're like, oh, we're on an island. Oh, this island is nice. How about this island? And then we're like, no, it's not an island. It just kind of was like a throwaway line, but I don't know. Because her mood, Susie's mood at least, does change as soon as she discovers that they're not on an island. And she's like, well, shit. Like, now we really have to get someone here to help us. We're not safe as I thought. So, yeah, I don't know. I kind of liked it.
Fair enough. I don't feel like you're right. Her attitude does shift, but only momentarily. Because then the power goes out and the emergency lighting comes on, which made me just want to switch over and watch Aliens instead. But they continue with their little bantering. So like her moment of panic was short-lived, and they're even about to kiss at one point when Dale remembers something and halts the kiss, and the soundtrack, as it did in a moment in part 2, it does this like comical wind down where it's building up to this moment of passion, and then boo, almost like a sad trombone. And so that was just one more little stylistic choice that I didn't like once before, and I didn't like it here either.
Or it was Ranger Dale's boner
sure.
retracting.
In which case, if it's diegetic, great. I'm all for it.
Right. And Susie's even like, what was that noise? Sorry, it does that sometimes.
What mechanism causes it to make that sound? He's got like gill slits on his dick.
Who knew we'd be spending so much time talking about Ranger Dale's dick?
I kept referring him into my notes as Roby-Wan Kenobi, but I haven't made that joke yet, so there we go.
I do like it.
Dick, gill slits, and Roby-Wan Kenobi. We get a little more from Allie about Megan and how she grew up to be angry and hateful and was looking for anything that gave her power. So that seems a little strange that she would fixate on Jason, especially if he was the reason for her anger and hatefulness. But really the only other thing that we get in terms of what Megan's plan was is that Billy was, in fact, bait for Jason. and Allie knew this, so that kind of makes me think he's not her brother. I don't know that Allie would go along with it if he was, but I don't really understand fully why Billy was being targeted as the specific bait, considering we didn't even get introduced to him until part 2.
I don't think it was just Billy. I think it was all of the friends were bait.
Oh, and she's just telling him because he's the one there.
Yeah, like she's saying like
got it.
you were bait, but I think she means like all
Along
of the
with
friends.
everybody else, you were bait.
Yeah.
I got it. Okay, that makes sense.
And this is kind of the last bit of explanation that we get for any kind of motives. And so let's just unpack it for a second. So Megan's parents were killed, presumably by Jason. She becomes obsessed and discovers that the only way, or decides that the only way to truly track down Jason is to use her friends as bait. So, okay, that's pretty fucked up and sinister, but like, I'll buy it. But there's still some weird things that happened along the way that don't line up with that. Like, why was Megan dressed as Jason? And why were those 2 other people dressed as Jason? I don't think we ever found out who they were because they never took their mask off, right?
Right.
So it's like, what was that part of the plan?
I mean, I get the sense that it was, Megan looking for anything that gives her power. She's just emulating Jason, and she's got this little gang of followers, probably because she was like so hot or something that they were like willing to go along with her evil schemes, just because that like made her feel good to kill people. And she lucked into finding Jason himself and was like, oh, well, he'll recognize me as this, follower of his, and he'll maybe he'll love me or blah blah blah, and then he just winds up killing her instead. But she, I think, was just kind of trying to follow in his footsteps and didn't necessarily expect him to show up, but was hoping that he would, so that she could pay tribute to him somehow, probably with a beej.
Which is why she does have that reaction at the end of part 1 when Jason shows up, where she's kind of like, hey, we're buddies. Look, I'm doing what you do. And then she just read the room completely wrong and got killed. But
right.
Okay. Yeah, I think that does track, because I did forget that in the first one, real Jason wasn't the only one doing killings, because I think we noticed in some of the murder scenes that there was inconsistencies in what Jason looked like, mm-hmm. and what he was wearing, or maybe what weapon he was carrying. And I think we decided that's because in some cases it was Megan and her 2 friends that were doing the killing, and in other times it was actually Jason. And then at the end of part 1, they all kind of end up in the same spot.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it's a little clumsy. I don't know what I wanted the explanation to be. I just don't know if I find this version very satisfying. Like, I don't know. I kind of wish there was something more to it. I don't know what that thing is, but I just feel like it's missing kind of a punch. Like, the fact that she was using her friends as bait, I thought was pretty shitty. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's a horrible thing to do. Mm-hmm. But without seeing any kind of like lead up to that, like I don't know what type of person Megan is, because the only references we have are just the occasional like, oh, Megan's coming, or here's a picture of Megan and she's giving me the middle finger, and so she's she's crazy and she's a little wild, and so the fact that she's using her friends as bait, like, I don't know if that's a sinister turn for her, because maybe she's just always been a bitch.
Yeah, I mean, the little like cult of Jason fans was the one thing that made this sub-series different from other Jason content, and it really didn't go anywhere with that. And in fact, I mean, they've just mentioned it for the final time, and we have 15 more minutes of this movie ahead of us. After this point, it becomes pretty much just a standard Jason movie, which is fine, but is not as interesting to me as the potential of this idea of copycats. And they just didn't run with that ball. They didn't lean into it very much, or properly explain or like they explain it, but they didn't do anything dramatic with it. Billy doesn't even seem all that phased to learn that he was, being victimized by his supposed friends. So I found it disappointing because it just didn't feel like any sort of payoff for a potentially interesting idea. Like you, I didn't really know what I would have expected from it, but I hoped that they had more of a point to it than it sounds like they wound up having.
Like, yeah, I agree. And the way I was kind of thinking of it too is if you think about the most recent Star Wars trilogy, where arguably one of the bigger plot points of that series is who is Rey, who are her parents. And in the first one, you're just learning who she is, or, being introduced to her. And then the second one, we're told, whether it's a lie or not, we're told that her parents are nobodies. And then in the third one, she, of course, ends up being a Palpatine or whatever. But like, imagine if the conclusion was, no, her parents really are nobodies. And you're just like, well, come on, you came up with this cool idea and then it just didn't pay off. Like, you didn't give me something.
We're going to get into a Star Wars debate because I thought it was awesome that her parents were nobody, because it broke the mold of everyone has to be someone special, or at least like have some lineage. And I really liked Rian Johnson in introducing the idea that anybody can wind up being special regardless of who their parents were. And so then when they revealed that she was Emperor Palpatine's granddaughter, I'm like, oh, well, that's a lot less interesting to me than her just being some random person who happens to be so powerful with the Force.
Right. And that's fine. Like, I don't care either way. It was more just like it would almost be like if they introduced in the third one that she is a Palpatine, but then at the end they're like, no, just kidding, she's nobody. And then it's like, because like you gave us something and it was building to something, and like, this is probably just my fault, and I'm going back to Here Comes the Night, but like, I was trying to build up this story and like, what is the answer, and then the solution, like, it's not bad. I'm not going to give this movie a downvote or anything because of it. I was just like, oh, well, it's just kind of a little bit of a letdown. And like you said, there's still 15 minutes left. So it's like, even the filmmakers, didn't feel like it was a big enough payoff to hold it off until the end.
Yeah, it just didn't amount to much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, the only thing I expected, or the only thing I hoped for from the answer, is that it would have made me want to go back and watch all three in a row to like unpack the full meaning of what was going on. And I have no desire to do that.
But the problem with doing that is Megan is not really a character in any of the movies. So you can't track any of that behavior and be like, oh, look, I can see where the flip or the switch is flipped and she becomes evil. It's like, we're being told about this person that we've never really met. I mean, she was on screen for like maybe 30 seconds and she gets killed. And so for me, I think that's probably what made the payoff unsatisfying, was because we're like, I just don't care about Megan because I don't know anything about her. If it turned out that Allison, if it turned out that Allison had a big role in this, that's an interesting twist. Like they kind of hinted at that at the end of part 2. That
raises an interesting point, because like Allie is as we'll come to find out, she's the sole survivor of the events of this movie. And so, I mean, she's like the heroic final girl, right? But if she knew that all of this was going on, where, some of her friends were planning to kill other of her friends, and she did nothing to try and stop it, she's kind of an asshole. Even if she wasn't actively involved. I mean, she knew what was going on and wasn't trying to stop it. So, like, fuck her.
Yeah, and I think they kind of botched that a little bit, too, because everything that she's telling us leads us to believe that what you just said is completely accurate. She probably did know all this. She may not have known to the full extent. Maybe she was thinking, using the friends as bait to scare them or to like lure Jason out of the woods or something, not necessarily fully intending to murder them herself or have Jason murder them. But yeah, it is. Allie probably does have a pretty big role in it. And that's probably why she's so, kind of like despondent in this third movie where she's like sitting by the fire by herself and she's not talking to anyone because she's probably like, shit, like all of this was in front of me. Like Megan was basically telling me exactly what she was doing and I didn't do anything to stop it.
Okay, fair enough.
So it's kind of like in retrospect, she's like, oh, that's what she meant when she said, I'm going to bring all my stupid friends to the woods and murder them.
This is like her, oh, fuck moment.
Like,
okay.
Like
Fair
she
enough.
wasn't just, it wasn't just a turn of phrase. Like it was, she was speaking literally. Yeah, kind of like, oh, I fucked up. Like, it was all there in front of me and I never did anything. So yeah, I guess that is probably the twist. Is that she had a role, could have stopped it or prevented it or whatever, but it still just was just kind of like, all right, fine.
So after that gut punch of a revelation about what's been going on, we check back in with Ranger Dale and Susie, who start talking about getting into bar fights as a self-defense tactic or something, and they're just yammering back and forth at this point. But Dale manages to get the power running again just in time for Jason to skewer him with the machete into the electrical box, complete with some obviously CGI sparks. Susie then gets impaled through the mouth, which is of course symbolic because she never shuts the fuck up.
But she was impaled with a pool stick, and I don't recall ever seeing a pool table at either the bunkhouse or Ranger Dale's fuck shack. Do you?
Oh, interesting. No, I didn't even know what implement that was. So
yeah, because like she's teasing him as they're walking out because she's like, you grabbed a pool stick? And he's like, hey. And I think that's what led to the bar fight thing.
Oh, right.
One thing I liked about this scene, though, and I don't know if it was intended by the filmmakers or not, but Jason's strategy of taking out Ranger Dale first. Ranger Dale was actually farther away from Jason than Susie was. Susie was basically right in front of him. And Jason takes out Ranger Dale. And the way I read it was because he's the bigger threat. You know, he's the guy, I guess. You know, he's theoretically
Sexist.
stronger. I mean, Susie could probably kick some ass, but I just saw it as like Jason wanting to take out the dude first, rather than like trying to take out Susie first and risk having Dale trying to stop him or something. I mean, it doesn't matter because they're both dispatched back to back, but yeah, I kind of liked it.
If I had been Jason, I would have killed her first just to silence her once and for all.
And let Dale live so he can always remember how annoying Susie was.
We're down to Allie and Billy as the survivors. They have one shotgun, which Billy arms himself with. And he goes to check the front porch, not really finding anything, but kind of, almost like playing a first-person shooter, moving around, searching corners and dark spots. Allie takes a header out the back door, and she finds a truck. Up front, Billy turns around, and Jason emerges from the mist that has engulfed the front porch and begins shooting Jason several times with the shotgun. And for the most part, Jason is shrugging it off, but one finally does cause him to go down and hit the deck.
I love that Billy's wearing jorts during this whole scene. It just didn't seem very intimidating, but the other thing that I thought was interesting was just how many shots he does fire off. He fires off 6 shots from the shotgun, which I thought was a lot. And I don't fire a lot of shotguns, so I didn't know if that was possible. So I just did some digging, and apparently it is. Like, I think most hunting shotguns hold between 2 to 5 shells, but they do have riot shotguns that can hold 6 to 10. I don't know.
So Ranger
one.
Dale's got a riot shotgun. I like it.
Well, and the shit goes down at Forest Green Park. You never know what you're going to need. Yeah, but Jason doesn't stay down for very long. He basically picks himself right back up, and he grabs Billy and dangles him over a cliff that we were never introduced to before, and we don't really ever see. It's just kind of like some camera trickery, but like he's holding Billy by the neck or the shirt over the edge of this cliff and drops him what seems like hundreds of feet below. So like, I don't know how they got up to this place, if they took the boat.
Yeah, it was very confusing because he drags him over to the edge, and I thought it was a dock.
Hmm.
But you hear him scream as Jason lets go. You don't see what happens, but I was expecting to hear like a splash or to find out that he like landed on his back on a rowboat and the anchor speared him or something. But we cut to quickly to Allie's reaction. She sees that this is happening, and then when we cut back, we see Billy's corpse laying crumpled at the bottom of this cliff, which, as you say, we never knew was there. So it was just very confusing until they showed his body. I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, I didn't know if they like dropped him down a staircase or something, but it was just because you don't. The camera never like pans back for obvious reasons, but it doesn't pan back to show that the cabin is on top of this giant cliff or mountain face or anything like that. It's just it's kind of like he just drops them into the darkness, and I was like, wait, what? And then the camera perspective that they show of Billy on the ground is taken from a bird's eye view, and he's really far down, and his leg is all mangled, and
so
like,
now Jason can collect the Soul Stone and complete the Infinity Gauntlet.
right.
Allie books it back for the truck, and fortunately the keys are hidden in the sun visor, so she's able to get it started. But she begins driving quickly in reverse to get as far away from Jason as possible. Unfortunately, she's not so great at steering because she winds up crashing into giant bales of hay that are in the barn on the property.
So this whole scene and everything that transpires afterwards is a little clumsy for me. Not just Allison's inability to drive in reverse, but just the way things kind of play out. But like you said, she's crashed into this barn, and I don't know why she stays in the barn, but she decides that she's going to hide there or something. And there's this little bit of a cat and mouse game that happens between Jason and Allison where she's hiding and he's looking for him.
And we get one really hilarious shot of Jason's legs, and he's got more shit in the pockets of his cargo pants than Tommy Wiseau.
Well, that's why his footsteps are so loud.
That makes perfect sense. That's why he's always stomping everywhere.
He's so weighted down with just crap.
Perfect.
And his, he's probably got tinnitus in his Charlie Brown ears from all the noise of him stomping around.
I want to do like sad Jason, Dun, 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 dun.
So eventually Allison kind of like corners Jason in the barn, and she tosses what I thought was a propane tank, like a gas, like a vapor gas fuel tank.
I thought it was a milk can, but okay.
Well, either one is about as logical for what happens next. But so she chucks it at his feet, and she pulls out the Zippo that we saw briefly before, and she's like, hey, asshole, or whatever she says. And she chucks the lighter on the ground, and it lights a trail of fuel, which a propane tank wouldn't leave. I mean, I guess if there's like a hole in it, you could potentially ignite the gas that's in the air, but this was clearly like liquid fuel that was on the ground leading toward Jason and the barn, but I don't think the tank ever really explodes. I think the barn just instantly goes up in flames, even like behind Allison, which doesn't make a lot of sense. Like the fire is starting behind her before it gets to, has a chance to like spread there. But it's just it's just a little weird. And again, I'm not faulting the filmmakers because I understand what they're dealing with. You can't really light a barn on fire and have people in there. So it's
sure you can. Oh, there's plenty of around here. We could find a barn we could light on fire.
But it's clearly like fake fire. There may have been like small fires burning here and there, but the most of the bigger stuff is put in post. But Jason's just kind of standing there, and there's no real sense of urgency for him to get out. And so Allison runs out, and she literally just slides the barn door closed. It doesn't look like she's latched it or jammed it shut or anything, right?
They don't show it. There is some sound work that makes it sound like she's bolting it somehow, or maybe securing a chain latch or something. But yeah, it's audio only. They don't show her doing anything to secure the door.
Okay. Because to me, it just looked like she was like sliding a, like a panel door, and it didn't even close all the way.
Right.
And then Jason gets to it and makes like this feeble attempt to get out, and then just decides, well, I'm stuck. I can't get out. And I'm like, what do you mean? Just reopen the door again. Like, you just slid it closed. But if there is sound that implies that she was putting in some like, some sort of latch, then I get it. Then that makes it a little bit harder for him to get out.
And I did like, there's a shot through the crack of the door of his mask, like with the eye hole of his mask, and you see the flame building behind him. That that was moody. I liked it. I thought it was a cool shot.
I like that too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean he's pounding on the door, but she's just kind of standing there watching. And the sun begins to rise as the barn goes up in smoke. So presumably Jason gets roasted.
Yeah, there's nothing that happens after the credits that tells us otherwise, but this was, to me, this was the ultimate cliffhanger, or the ultimate conclusion to the story, because we were told at the second one that the dawn approaches, and I'm like, what's the dawn? When is it going to get here? And finally, the dawn is here, and I'm like,
the dawn arrives.
So we have all of our answers, and everything has been cleared up.
Yes. We get one final shot of her as the sun continues to climb in the sky. She's canoeing back across this little pond to a shack. Is it supposed to be the dock from part 2 that they escaped from Ted on? I couldn't really tell.
Yeah, I think it might have been the same. Yeah, because I think there was kind of like a shed on the, like, I remember them like kind of walking through like a covered area.
Covered area, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't really think there was any connection to where she was going, but yeah, that does make sense that she's just heading back to where they started from. Yeah, so that it just kind of ends.
Yeah, so, written and directed by Tim McCormack. This movie came out in January of 2023, so it's only a couple months old. I don't know. This one was nice looking. I thought, sure they had some CGI After Effects that were a little janky, but, more power to them. But it was nicely shot. I enjoyed each one of these, but I just found them frustrating. I found them frustrating that they didn't have a bigger story planned with the ideas that they came up with.
I agree. Yeah, I liked them, for the most part, and I just feel like there could have been, like, instead of just giving us an answer to what was going on in the first two, like, throw in one more twist and like lean into something a little bit more. Like, if Allison really was a part of it, have the audience figure that out, but no one else in the movie knows that. And so we're just like, holy shit, like they can't trust her either. And then that kind of makes her survival a little bit more of a sting, because it's like, oh, she doesn't deserve to live. Like,
right.
She was just as shitty as Megan. And but they didn't lean into that enough. But I agree. I think the movies look great. There were certain points in this, the third one, where I was really surprised by just how good it looked. I think one that comes in mind was Allison in the bathroom and just how those scenes were lit. And I thought they did a lot of really good editing. Like, in some of these fan films we watch, there's always kind of like one element that just doesn't quite work, and it kind of takes you out of the moment. But I feel like all these movies look very professionally made, and we've never criticized any of the acting in any of these movies, because it's not, or any of the fan films, because it's none of our business. And it doesn't really bother me if they're good or bad actors. But I just thought, from like an overall production standpoint, I liked it. And you alluded to this earlier. I applaud the filmmakers for trying something different. There's so many of these fan films that we're watching where they're not. And I just feel like if I was going to make a fan film, I would want to try something different because there's no constraints. And you're just like, hey, we're not bound by any kind of like studio or mythology to tell us what we can or can't do with Jason Voorhees. So let's try something a little bit different that people haven't seen before. And that's what these guys did. And so I'm thankful for that. And, you know, it may not have been as, you know, wholly satisfying as I would have liked it to be, but that it's fine. I mean, I'm glad they tried something different.
Yeah, I agree. It wasn't necessarily successful, but I admired. I had the highest hopes for where they were going with it, and it fell short. But you know, so be it. I think my biggest complaint, in hindsight, is that they spent so much time with quote unquote hilarious banter between unimportant characters that they shortchanged what would have been the important relationships to explore further, like everyone's relationship with Megan, or even like Billy and Davis as a couple. We only learn that as a fact in this third one, and they could have leaned into that more to make Davis's death more compelling. Or make it just seem like the emotional stakes for all of this were much higher. But instead we were getting, you know, jokey characters that were just, you know, improving back and forth. And I felt like that really shortchanged the story that could have been a lot about, you know, friendship betrayals and that kind of thing. That would have been interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was one thing I was thinking where rather than having like one character be the keeper of the secret and knowing all the details about what was going on, it was kind of like having a scene where you have Billy and Allison and Susie sitting around and they all start to tell what they know. And then together they're like, they piece together the actual solution. They're like this piece on its own doesn't mean a whole lot, but this piece plus this piece and this piece, it's like, holy shit, she was planning this all along. And like, that would have been kind of a cool reveal rather than Allison just having the secret all along and then just for whatever reason deciding not to tell anybody.
Yeah, that would have been awesome. And join us next week for Well, I think it's time for us to say goodbye to Here Comes the Night. So, yeah, I think that the next one that we're going to cover is Jason Unleashed, which came out in May of 2022.
Yeah, so we're going to go back to the release schedule. But, yeah, so that's what we'll do next.
One thing I feel like we've maybe not done as good a job as we should. Obviously, we ripped the format of our show off from the Star Wars Minute, but there's a whole community of similarly structured podcasts out there. So if you're enjoying the format of this show, I recommend you go to moviesbyminutes.com, and there are a couple hundred now different shows that cover everything from science fiction movies to Kevin Smith movies to even just kind of random one-off stuff. We got name checked on the Karate Kid Minute and a couple of Kevin Smith podcast episodes. So, I mean, you know, check it out. If you're likely to find another series to follow, and there's some great shows on there.
Even Dunstan checks in 1 minute at a time. So if that's your thing, go check it out. But yeah, I agree. So to find out what room temperature drinks give me instant brain freeze, tune in to the next episode of You're All
Doomed.